Welcome to episode 3 of Stronger Than Reason. This is the episode where we take our first step outside of the world of industrial rock. Don't worry, it's electronic, it's synth pop, so it's industrial adjacent. We're going to talk about New Order, a band that is pivotal in the development of dance music, especially the merging of rock and dance, and in particular their compilation album, Substance 1987. This album was released alongside a Joy Division album, which is also called Substance 1987. And for those who aren't aware, which I can't imagine there are many of you watching this, New Order used to be Joy Division. There were some fairly large events that happened that transformed the band and changed their name. But for now, we're just going to talk about New Order. The purpose of both of those Substance albums was to collect each band's singles into one tidy package. So to start our discussion, let's jump in the Wayback Machine and dial it back to, I don't know, maybe late summer of 1990. That's when I first heard this record. That's when I first heard New Order. This is actually the first New Order that I ever heard in my life. I was visiting a guy I knew. He wasn't really a friend, but he was a guy who was a year or so older than me and therefore was more worldly and sophisticated. Still kind of friendly. We were friendly even if we weren't really friends. But he played 2 records for me on that fateful day. And in my mind, it was kind of a sunny, maybe late summer kind of day, and we had the windows open and the birds were singing and that kind of thing. So it's a very distinct memory in my mind. But he played 2 records. One was Substance, the first few tracks off of this. The other was Pretty Hate Machine by 9 Inch Nails, which was, I guess, had been out for a year or so at that point, but really was just coming into our world at that time. Both of these albums were tremendously influential on me and my friends. We played them all the time. Certainly going to talk about Pretty Hate Machine at some point in the future. But for now, again, we're going to focus on New Order. So the first New Order track I ever heard was off this record, and it was Ceremony. And it wasn't long before he or someone else made me, copies of cassettes on cassette of both of these Substance discs. And listening to them, my first impressions of New Order was that the music was very simple. In fact, more than maybe any other band, New Order inspired me to pick up a guitar and play some bass or keyboard because they made it seem easy, but the songs had emotional weight. They weren't just aggressive like some of the other music I was listening to. For instance, looking at this track list, Ceremony is a very kind of plaintive song, and the next track is Everything's Gone Green, which is sort of a creepy dance tune. Temptation is the third track, and it had a very hopeful, kind of happy, positive vibe to it. And of course, Blue Monday, classic New Order track, probably their best known track, very kind of technical and cold and aloof. So right away, the first few tracks of this album, you're seeing, an emotional range that wasn't present on some of the other music I was listening to. And yet the music was very simple. They were putting together simple ingredients and coming up with these great dishes, so to speak. Another thing that jumped out at me was that there was just a lot of music on this album. And I thought that was unusual. I was used at the time to hearing 2.5 minute to 3 minute pop songs on the radio. Again, we're going back to like 1990. What I didn't realize was that for the most part, these were all 12-inch mixes. That's why they were extended. And I had no idea what a 12-inch mix was. We'll talk more about that later. But what I realized was that, wow, these songs really have a lot of room. They have a lot of time to breathe and develop. And the songs were interesting. They weren't just like verse, chorus, verse structures, so there were other things going on. And what I didn't realize was that these are being 12-inch singles, they were kind of geared toward the dance floor and a club environment and keeping people dancing, at least definitely the later tracks were geared that way. So that might explain some of the strange arrangements. The other thing was that there were a lot of tracks on this album. It's actually on CD, a double album, so there's 2 CDs, each of which have 12 tracks on them. That's a lot of music. That's over 2 hours of music. And the other thing that was really clear to me was that the bass was super weird. Uh, I noticed right away that whoever was playing bass wasn't playing proper bass. They were playing, high up on the neck of the guitar. They were playing really melodic passages. They weren't just laying down the rhythm. And most of the proper bass on these songs was synthesized. And it created a distinctive sound. So you had a synthesized keyboard bass that was sequenced, but then you had this bass player who was playing almost like a tenor guitar, like high up on the neck, a lot of melodies. So that was unusual. But it made me wonder, who is this band that they were able to put all this music together and they have such a deep history? Again, this was the pre-internet days. There were not many ways to get that kind of information. And New Order's record sleeves were by design made to convey almost no information at all. And that was the brainchild of their designer, Peter Saville. He designed nearly all of their sleeves for all of their albums and singles. So this band was a total mystery to me. What little I did know, I was able to talk to some friends, and they told me that New Order sprang from the ashes of Joy Division when Joy Division's singer, whose name we didn't know, some guy, committed suicide. And that much was true. And I could tell from the liner notes here that they came from Factory Records from Manchester, England. That was on the sleeve. And the sleeves were all designed by Peter Saville Associates. And it was clear from the credits of Substance that some of the early tracks were produced by a guy named Martin Hannett. So that's really all I knew, maybe for a year or so, until 2 things happened. There were 2 keys that occurred that unlocked more information for me. One was that I saw a video on MTV, and it was probably on 120 minutes, because I remember that I recorded it on a VHS tape, and I probably still have that VHS tape somewhere in the archives. But I recorded it, and they played a video of the song The Perfect Kiss. And if you haven't seen that, stop what you're doing right now and look up the video for The Perfect Kiss and watch it. It actually shows the band playing the song live. So, I went from having no insight at all into who these people were into actually watching them perform the music, and it was just a revelation to me, because in my mind, listening to this sort of semi-computerized music, I couldn't visualize what was going on. Could you even perform this music, or was it just composed on a computer somewhere? But yeah, they're in the video playing the song live. They're not just lip syncing. And it showed who the members of the band were and what they were doing. And what's interesting is that the video was directed by Jonathan Demme, who was famous not long after for directing the movie The Silence of the Lambs. So, no slouch there in the director department. MTV ended up playing the short version. It was only 3 minutes long or so. The full version of that video is over 9 minutes. It's actually a short film that was played in theaters once upon a time. But immediately, I grabbed my Casio keyboard and taught myself the keyboard parts. And I say taught, but I wasn't really teaching myself. They were trivial to play. And that was a real eye-opener for me, that professionally made pop music could be so simple. And it just, that whole punk aesthetic, that you could do this yourself. The people who were producing the music, there was not necessarily anything special about them, and that's exactly how New Order, if you know their history, how they got started as well as Joy Division, because they all showed up for a Sex Pistols concert, and Manchester, and they were inspired to go out and create this band. And many other bands got their start that way, thanks to the Sex Pistols and the punk movement. So the other thing that really opened the door to me understanding this band was getting access to the internet. So that happened when I went to college in the early 90s. I logged on to my horrible amber screen terminal, figured out how to do FTP and Telnet and email, and it was the early days, kids. There was no web. You had to know protocols. You had to, be able to do command line stuff. Very primitive. But I discovered a mailing list, and it was a New Order Joy Division mailing list that was called Ceremony at the time. And those of you out there who were on the Ceremony list, greetings. I was there with you back in the day. What is a mailing list? Well, gather around, kids, and I'll tell you. These were the days, like I said, before the web. You had to send an email to a certain address to subscribe. And every now and then you'd receive an email back from the group, and these were typically digests, so every message you'd get would contain anywhere from 1 to 30 more emails that other people had sent to the group. And you'd conduct conversations that way, all via email, and it's kind of like an early bulletin board, so super early social media. But finding that for this band, for me, was like turning on a tap. I mean, fans were suddenly able to share information with each other and compare notes and talk about gigs and talk about releases, and it was really interesting. And I was on that list from about 1991 to maybe 1996. I learned the names of the band members. I learned about other projects they were involved in. I learned all about the band's history as New Order and Joy Division, and all about Factory Records and so on. We'd all ask these sort of train spotting type questions about different releases and different mixes. And at this time, New Order was producing tons of different music on tons of different formats, and it was nearly impossible to collect it all. And especially where I lived in the middle of nowhere, I didn't have access to the cool imports and rare vinyl, so it was tougher for me. But I thought it was very fascinating to see all the music that they were making, and all the different things they were involved in. Was really interesting. So a few times I even bought or sold music through the group, and you develop connections with these people. These are your people. These are folks that you have something in common with, and that was a good thing about the internet at the time. And it was really it was like representing every kind of interpersonal interaction you could expect to have on the internet today. But again, the funny thing was it was all through email. But finding Ceremony, the mailing group, turned me from a casual fan into a super obsessed fan, and it also led to me greatly expanding my music collection. Much of that is now moot now that it's all on YouTube and Spotify. So how did this album come about? We're gonna have to just dip briefly into some band history. I'm not gonna go deep into it because obviously you can read all about it on Wikipedia if you care, and I assume that you know most of this stuff anyway because you're watching this video or listening to this podcast. But in a nutshell, Joy Division formed in 1977 in Manchester, England. They released 2 studio albums, Unknown Pleasures and Closer. In 1980, so a few years after they were formed, their lead singer, Ian Curtis, at age 24, I think he was, young man, very young man. Unfortunately, he was not well, and he committed suicide. The rest of the band decided to press on. They really didn't have it in them to do anything but press on. The rest of the band were Bernard Sumner, who was their keyboard player and guitarist at the time, and Peter Hook, who played bass, and Stephen Morris, who played drums. They decided that they would change their name, and they picked New Order, and they brought in Jillian Gilbert, who was Steve Morris's girlfriend at the time, to also play keyboard and guitar, thereby freeing up Bernard Sumner to mostly sing. Because I think it's great too that Bernard never figured out how to sing while playing guitar. So this is the level of musicianship we're at, folks, which is great because it means any of us can do this stuff, right? If they can succeed, you know, which isn't to say that these guys aren't talented. They're immensely talented. They're just not doing things the traditional way. And you can succeed without doing things the traditional way, which is fascinating. They started recording and touring as New Order almost immediately, and they interestingly chose to not play any of the old Joy Division songs. They essentially started over from scratch, basically not even telling people that they had been Joy Division. So a lot of times the crowd would show up and just think they were a completely different band, which they essentially were. If you haven't already, and this interests you at all, I would highly recommend reading Peter Hook's biography about this period of time, his tenure in New Order. It's called Substance Inside New Order. Peter Hook was New Order's bassist up through 2006 when he left the band. He is a tight AA personality. He's the closest New Order ever had to having a rock god in their ranks. And whatever else you might think of Peter Hook, he is a fantastic storyteller. His books are funny. I think you'd find his book interesting even if you had no interest in this band. Just tells some great stories. This is the perspective of somebody who's lived probably several lives worth of crazy things happening. And he's written 3 books. One is about his time in Joy Division, one is about his time in New Order, and the third is about his experiences running the Hacienda, which was a legendary nightclub in Manchester that New Order owned and operated. So they went on to release 4 studio albums before Substance, some of which I'll probably talk about here. But they also released about a dozen singles during those years. So let's talk about the singles. New Order singles were never on the albums. They viewed that as a rip-off when bands would, put a song on the album and then release it as a single because the fans have to pay for it twice. So they thought that if they had a few extra songs, they'd put them out as a single, never on the album. So there was more to collect. There was more to get. Why did they release singles? That had to do with dance culture. So they were interested in bridging the world of rock with the world of dance. And they wanted their music played in clubs, like the clubs that they saw in New York when they first visited in 1980. They went to the Danceteria and other famous clubs at the time and were really impressed with everything they saw there. They wanted to be a part of that culture. And 12-inch singles were necessary if you wanted to be played in clubs. And the reason was that 12-inch vinyl format gave more physical space for that single track and more physical space for the record grooves, which allowed more space for bass sounds. So the bass on a 12-inch record went lower and it sounded better in a club, and that's essential to get people dancing. So New Order, like a lot of other electronic bands at the time, were releasing singles. Now these singles also had B-sides, they had also remixes, there were what we call dub remixes, which were more or less just instrumental versions of the songs that could be played at a club, or they could be mixed into the regular version or other songs at a club by a DJ who could do that kind of thing. So the singles, there were a lot of them. But the way this compilation came about was sometime in 1986, Tony Wilson, who was one of the heads of Factory Records, who had signed New Order, had gotten a CD player. I think it was in his Jaguar. So he was an eccentric guy, Tony Wilson. You can definitely learn more about him. It seems like almost everybody who was involved with Factory Records was a real character. And I don't know if that's because they've been caricatured so much over the years in different media, but it really does seem like, from everything that I've read and watched about that period of time, that it was a real cast of characters involved with that. But anyway, Tony Wilson had a CD player, and a CD at the time, the mid-'80s, was an emerging format. And he wanted to have a CD of all of New Order's singles that he could play while driving around. So Factory decided to put that together, and it was financially shrewd because it became New Order's best-selling album, even though it wasn't a studio album. So let's take a look here at the artwork. Very minimalist. Again, this was designed by Peter Saville. He was given free rein to do whatever he wanted with all of the New Order sleeves, and he generally did. In fact, oftentimes the band didn't even know what the sleeve was going to look like. But he famously liked to keep things very minimalistic. He never showed the band, and some sleeves he never even said what the band was or the title of the release or anything like that. In fact, on some early releases, as you know, he went so far as to make a code of colored blocks that you had to decode to figure out what information was, like the name of the band and the title of the release and the catalog number and all that. So he was a nutty guy who maybe wasn't doing them favors in some ways, but also his idea was that he'd keep the sleeves very simple so that they were immediately recognizable by people who knew. So he considered these minimalistic sleeve designs to be a shared secret of sorts, if you will. And that was also interesting and, you know, again, a very forward-thinking kind of attitude for the 1980s. But yeah, minimalism was in. And there's a little artwork here. There's a flower picture inside this sleeve for the disc 1. Disc 2, very similar. This is a piece of coral, and they used a special process to get this sort of graded color here, which Peter Saville talks about in some of his books. Interesting stuff. So yeah, disc B wasn't included in all the markets, so or all the different formats, and in certain markets it was included and or not. So the idea here is that disc 1 contains, or disc A contains all of the A sides, and disc B would contain all the B sides, but that's not entirely true. There are a few exceptions in here. But yeah, this second disc is like another 12 songs or maybe more in some formats that you didn't always get when you were buying Substance. Sometimes you just got these 12 A-sides. There's a few differences in what they released on this record versus what was released as the singles. They re-recorded 2 songs completely, Temptation and Confusion, for whatever reason. I don't know, I guess the band thought the original recording sounded a little dated. Some edits were done, like on The Perfect Kiss and Shell Shock, so they're actually shrunk in length in order to fit on this format. And some of the B-sides are missing from a few of the singles, but nothing really tremendously important, I would say. The song titles for a lot of these songs at this period in time, New Order would pick their song titles from the names of old films. So that's sort of funny. For almost any of these early song titles, you can, you know, Google it and figure out what the original film was for that. So let's go track by track here. If we're looking at disc 1, talk about these songs a little bit. Starts off with Ceremony. This song like really reminds me of winter. It's the first New Order song I ever heard. Probably my favorite New Order song overall. In fact, it's really a Joy Division song. So there are 2 recordings of Joy Division playing this song with Ian Curtis singing. And famously, New Order had to try to equalize these recordings to figure out what his words were. And in the end, I think they ended up making up their words for their version of the song. The second track is Everything's Gone Green. It's kind of this like proto-techno track. Peter Hook wrote in his book that the band figured out how to use what he called pulsed 16th notes on the synthesizer that they were using. And those pulses actually aren't in sync with the song, but the band was stopping and starting the synthesizer to keep it in sync so that they kind of fudged it, which is funny. Temptation is track 3, maybe their second best known song, and this is a re-recording, like I said, very catchy. Blue Monday is track 4, definitely their best known song, supposedly the best-selling 12-inch single ever. It is miles ahead, style-wise, to where music was when it was released in 1983. So in that respect, it's kind of like the Apollo moon landing, how, the idea of the Apollo moon landing was that the United States managed to, you know, pull time out of the 21st century and stick it in the middle of the 1960s somehow. That effort was so far ahead of its time, yet still happened. And that's how I feel about Blue Monday. That's a song that still sounds fresh today and fits right in with, the dance music culture of the 21st century. Confusion was their first collaboration with Arthur Baker in New York City. It's kind of a straight up dance track. Thieves Like Us was also a collaboration with Arthur Baker. It's this kind of slower, pretty pop song with somewhat out of tune singing. But The Perfect Kiss is one of my favorite songs, just based on the video, if for no other reason. It's got this really complicated arrangement, a really long introduction, a really long and fantastic instrumental outro. The song always went over live very well. Just a fantastic ending to this track. Subculture, kind of like a more generic dance song. I never felt strongly about it. Shell Shock, this is what happens, kids, when you take too much coke. Don't do it. State of the Nation, not really my favorite. I actually prefer the B-side to this, Shame of the Nation, which we'll talk about in a minute. Bizarre Love Triangle, another very famous track of theirs, maybe their third most famous. It's really just a straight up dance track, because on Substance they chose to include a remix by Shep Pettibone that completely erased Peter Hook's bass, which is ridiculous and almost a sin in my book. True Faith, this is a great classic track that was written just for this album as a teaser. It was co-written and produced by Stephen Hague, who has an online diary about it, if you want to read about that on the internet. So if we jump to the second disc, we have some of the B-sides and other A-sides. We have In a Lonely Place. This is another Joy Division song like Ceremony. It's very gloomy, very dark, has great tom-tom work from Steve Morris. Procession is a song that Steve wrote. It's very poppy and upbeat. It's not like the Joy Division songs at all. This was an A-side on a 7-inch record. I really like these early New Order singles, by the way. They're just amazing. Mesh is actually mistitled. The real name for this song is Cries and Whispers. Mesh is actually the name of another song that wasn't included on Substance in most formats. It's a pretty cool synth kind of tune. Cries and Whispers starts with synthesizer. Mesh starts with Peter Hook's bass, which is how you can tell them apart. Hurt was the B-side to Temptation. One of their early, I think it was one of the early songs with a drum machine, but meh. The Beach was the dub version of Blue Monday, meh. Confusion Instrumental is exactly what you would think it is. Lonesome Tonight is a gem. This is like a straight up different song, like a full B-side, and Peter Hook would later reuse this bass line on Run years later. Lonesome Tonight was always great live. You can see that on YouTube. Just a fantastic song, and you can actually hear Barney spit, like at one point when he's singing the song. He just hawks a loogie, and it's hilarious. Murder is a really cool, kind of darker, drum-driven track that was a B-side to, I think, Thieves Like Us. Actually, Murder was its own A-side, but it was released in conjunction with the Thieves Like Us single. And it was backed with the Thieves Like Us instrumental, which is exactly what you'd think. Kiss of Death was a dub version of The Perfect Kiss. Shame of the Nation was kind of a re-recording of State of the Nation. It wasn't really a dub version at all. It was just, in my opinion, a better recording of the song. And finally, 1963 was a song that was new at the time. It was written alongside True Faith with Stephen Hague. It was sort of a double A-side. It's kind of a goofy song about the Kennedy assassination. I don't know. Anyway, the single from Substance was True Faith. And here I actually have the vinyl version of True Faith, which isn't going to fit in camera. But I don't own much vinyl, and I actually have no record player. But, you know, I do have a copy of True Faith backed with 1963. So, The impact of Substance, it's a de facto best of despite being just a singles collection. It ignores most of the album tracks, many of which were amazing. But for a lot of people, this being their most popular album, this was their only taste of New Order. It seemed to me that like the early New Order albums were really kind of collections of tracks and weren't very cohesive. That definitely wasn't true for the album after Substance, which we'll talk about some other time. I think that was their best studio album and their creative peak. But anyway, with Substance, it's really showing the band warts and all. Barney's singing on Thieves Like Us, pretty off key. They re recorded Temptation and Confusion just to kind of clean those tracks up. There's a lot of funny quirks like Barney spitting on Lonesome Tonight. So it shows the band sort of, the good side and the not so great side. These songs are very simple yet sophisticated, and you can hear them on these tracks grappling with new technologies. They were always looking for the next thing, and that's something that I think was common in electronic bands in the 80s as new technology was just coming out all the time, right? So there was a lot to get your head around, a lot of new things to try in the studio, and they were certainly on the forefront of that. This record is interesting in that it sort of shows the band coming from a very Joy Division place at the time. They sounded a lot like Joy Division in the early tracks, but then went in this completely different dance rock direction. Temptation really cracked that mold, I think. Famously, Tony Wilson used to tell the story of Barney ad-libbing the lyrics live, and that being the moment where he found his voice that was apart from Ian Curtis's voice. Blue Monday certainly tore the Joy Division mold to shreds and, set the standard for what dance music could be. And I think it blew a lot of minds back in the day, for sure. How it holds up today, this music is largely timeless, folks. A few of the later sounds, especially on like Subculture and Shell Shock, they sound a little bit dated to me. There's like 80s style hand claps in them and stuff, but on the other hand, that kind of gives the song some character. And this was released just before the boom in remix culture that would produce thousands of crappy, unrelated remixes of every song. So you'd buy a single and it would have 6 different remixes, none of which would have any resemblance to the original track at all, and were just made by musicians or DJs who were trying to make a name for themselves. So I'm pretty cynical about that era of music in general, but this is edging up to that, but not quite getting into that territory. The mixes here were mostly done by the band or close affiliates with the band's involvement, so they're tasteful and interesting. And overall, it's just an amazing collection of what's arguably the band's best years. Although, like I said, the next album, Technique, is, in my opinion, outstanding as well. And it's kind of too bad that they didn't include it here, because there were some great singles on Technique as well. So, where are they today? After Substance, they went through cycles of releasing an album, going on hiatus, and reuniting, and that went on for 3 more albums. Of course, Manchester in general went through the Madchester phase in 89 to 90 or 91. It was, supposedly the second summer of love with everyone taking ecstasy and going to the Hacienda and the Rise and Fall, the Happy Mondays, etc., and all the other bands. But New Order went through that. Factory Records blew up in 92. You can watch the movie 24-Hour Party People by Michael Winterbottom to see how that went. And New Order ended up signing with London Records. Throughout the mid-90s, the Hacienda was still around, and New Order, owned that building, owned the club, along with their manager, Rob Gretton. And it ate up a lot of their money. Frankly, a lot of the money that they made in the music business, the band never saw, because it was going directly into the Hacienda. And if you read Peter Hook's book about that club, it's called How Not to Run a Club. And he wrote it and titled it that for a good reason, because they were essentially just throwing away New Order's fortune and, throwing plenty of good money after bad. A lot of that was driven by the band's manager, Rob Gretton. another really interesting guy. He was their manager since Joy Division. Real character. He died, unfortunately, in 1999, but he lived long enough just to convince the band to reconvene again. And they came together in the early 2000s, released another album. And there was like another album or two, but in 2006, Peter Hook split for good. The others continued, but this time they didn't change their name. So there is a band out there today called New Order that's still playing and recording. It has 3 of the 4 original members and then 2 other guys. In my mind, that isn't really the same band. Hooky was a key part of their signature sound, the way he played the bass. I guess the new guys kind of playing the bass or trying to in a similar sort of way. But to me, without Peter Hook, it's just not New Order. So yeah, members were coming and going in the early part of the 21st century, but in these days they're largely touring as a nostalgia act. Let's be honest here. They did release one new album post Peter Hook, and I don't know, I haven't listened to it. I guess they had a little more creativity left in them, but you know, whatever. Hooky has his own band, Peter Hook and the Light. They're touring and playing the entire Joy Division and New Order catalogs, all the B-sides, all the album tracks, just kind of going album by album. And he has done tours where he's played New Order's Substance and Joy Division's Substance just straight through, which I think is really interesting. So if you think about it, there's kind of 2 New Order Joy Division cover bands out there, both with original members. One just happens to still be called New Order. But to me, Hooky's band rings truer to the ideals that they originally had in these bands. But anyway, that's New Order's Substance. Someday, I will talk about Joy Division's Substance. I will probably talk about each of New Order's albums in time because I'm a huge fan and all of their music means a lot to me. Whenever I hear that opening bit of Ceremony, it gives me distinct memories of the winter of 1991 with snow coming down, remembering things that were going on in my life at the time. And it's a good feeling, and it doesn't go away, even though that was more than 30 years ago. So that's New Order's Substance. If you like this discussion, stay tuned. I will talk about more 80s and 90s music in future episodes. Stronger Than Reason is on YouTube. It's available as a podcast, so as the kids say these days, like and subscribe. And if you made it this far, thank you for listening. We'll see you next time.